And I stress the word professionalism, because right touch regulation is regulation that supports health professionals to do their jobs to the best of their ability. It's not regulation that restrains, it's not regulation that punishes, it's not regulation that is full of rules that you can't follow. It's regulation that lifts up people's professionalism and frees them to be good. And we use the word excellence at the end of that first sentence. Excellence is a very difficult concept in some ways. And I think it's important to stress that in right touch regulation, we see excellence not as an outcome, as an end, but as a journey. Excellence is a process. It's how we do things, not what we achieve as the final result. So being excellent is an activity, not a destination. And that's an important underlying piece of thinking. Right touch regulation is about balance. And I want to stress this as much as I can. If we take that little image of an old-fashioned set of scales, I expect you all have digital scales now, but I have some scales like that at home, which I inherited from my father. And they're very nice to play with. And the thing about those sort of scales is when you put the flour or the sugar or whatever it is in one balance, it goes down. And then you want the weight in, and you're trying to get the scales to balance. And if there's too much flour, then the scale looks like that. If there's not enough, it looks like that. And what we're trying to achieve in right touch regulation is the balance of regulatory force to ensure that we are using just enough regulation to achieve what we want, and not too little, because too little won't work, and not too much, because that's a waste of effort. So we're really trying to ensure that we have balance. And you'll find when I talk a bit more about what right touch thinking is, it's often balance in our decision making, balance in our use of resources, balance in our understanding of people, balance in our understanding of risk. All these things are fundamental concepts in right touch regulation. So there are 8 principles of right touch regulation. They're fairly simple steps that we should take when we are deciding whether or not to regulate. But they're also a good guide for all our organizational thinking. And the first step is always identify the problem before the solution. I'm sure you all know the experience of going into a meeting and someone says, we've got a problem to solve, and immediately 3 people suggest solutions. And you've never discussed the problem, you've only jumped to a solution before you've analyzed the problem. And yet in healthcare, we analyze problems all the time. We look beyond the symptoms of a condition in order to find its cause. And in right touch regulation, we need to do the same. We need to look beyond the symptoms of the problem to the cause of the problem. And we need to aim our regulatory activity at the cause and not at the symptom. The second principle is to quantify and qualify the risks. Now, risk assessment is something that we are often very lax about. So we jump to decisions about risk in the same way that we jump to decisions about the problem we're trying to solve. There can be risks which are minor but very common. There can be risks that are severe but very rare. And we often can't find the right balance between how do we respond to risks that might be very severe or risks that are common but very minor. Where should we put our effort? Where should we put our effort in healthcare, for instance, worrying about population risks compared with individual risks? Let me give you a few examples of the difficulty of deciding about where to place your effort on risk. A few years ago, the Chief Medical Officer in the UK asked me to chair a review of cosmetic practice and to try and work out where the risks lay and whether there should be more regulation. And during our deliberations, which was just after the time when in the UK we'd had an outbreak of BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and there was a lot of panic going on about whether BSE could be transmitted to humans through Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. And we found, of course, that many people who had dermal fillers injected into their faces were using dermal fillers that had collagen in it. And collagen, of course, is made from cows' hooves. So there was a theoretical risk that BSE, CJD could be transmitted through collagen. It was only a theoretical risk. But when we included that in our report, of course, the newspapers and the media were very excited. And all the headlines were not about what we were doing to help make cosmetic practice safe, but what the risk was of getting CJD. Now that was a disproportionate, that was an unbalanced response to a risk, because I can tell you that over the 20 years or more since that report came out, there is, to my knowledge, not a single case in the world of CJD arising from someone who had a collagen injection. So we need to decide when we're analysing risks just what happens and what really we need to do to intervene. The third principle is get as close to the problem as possible. Regulators sit, if I may say so, in ivory towers. They are in offices away from the front line of healthcare. And they often work through expert committees who are some of the best people in the profession. And the best people write standards which are so high, so complex, so difficult to meet, that ordinary health professionals on the front line, in a busy ward, in an operating theatre, having to make decisions there and then, in the moment, are disadvantaged by those standards and can't meet them. So we want standards that are as close to the real world that people work in. Let me tell you another story. I was working with some clinical directors in hospitals, and I asked them to share with me and with each other some real examples of situations that had gone dangerously wrong and whether more regulation would have made any difference. And two nurses told me a story of a child who had cancer and who was in hospital and had a drip. And this child needed the drip changed in the middle of the night. and it was dark, and he was asleep. The regulations said that 2 nurses should go in together and change the drip, but they didn't want to wake him up. So 1 nurse went in, and 1 nurse stood in the doorway of the ward to watch. And the nurse who went in changed the drip, but it was dark, they didn't want to turn the light on, and she made a mistake, and she got the 2 tubes the wrong way round. Now that could have been a really serious clinical error. Fortunately, the nurse at the door went in herself afterwards and checked, found the error. Between them, they corrected it. But these were 2 people in the real world doing what they believed was the right thing. Yes, they slightly broke the rules, but they were working in the real world, and the rules were perhaps not helpful. And when we talked about it and said, could regulation have made a difference? The only thing they could come up with, but which was sensible, was maybe that the color coding on the drip tubes could have been luminescent, so they could have been seen at night more easily than it was. And that's the kind of thing that right touch regulation would do, thinking always about the reality of the circumstances in which health professionals have to make decisions. The 4th principle is focus on the outcome. Right touch regulation is interested in outcomes, it's not interested in process. It's interested in delivering change for people, not just in making people follow rules. So think about what you're trying to achieve rather than how you're going to do it. And someone asked me yesterday, where do you start with right touch regulation? And I said, you start at the end. You don't start at the beginning. You start at what you want to achieve, not where you're going to go. 5th, use regulation only when necessary. Regulation is a blunt instrument. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's elaborate. There are lots and lots of safety changes that you can make in healthcare practice that don't require regulation. And many of them, some of them will be here in this exhibition over the next day or so. There are many of the innovations in patient safety have come not from regulation, but from hospitals creating their own safety programs and being focused on clinical practice there and then. So regulation shouldn't intervene when there are alternative approaches, particularly of trusting professionals to do their job properly. 6th, keep it simple. I can't say that often enough. If you can't, as a regulator, if you can't explain your regulations to a frontline practitioner, how do you expect them to understand them and put them into practice? There's a great deal of what I would call, from that old film title, lost in translation. So you say to the regulator, oh, we took lots of advice from lots of real practitioners, and then you say to the practitioners, what do you think of those regulations? And they say, we can't put that into practice, it doesn't work in the real world. Somehow the regulation has been lost in translation. Then 7th, check for unintended consequences. Now we're trying, in health professional regulation, we're trying to change people's behavior. People don't like having their behavior changed. People resist change. And so it's naive to think that if you tell people to do something differently, they will. Or that if you set a rule they will always follow it. I like to say that the worst regulators that I know are your IT managers. Now, you don't necessarily think of IT managers as regulators, but I can tell you they make rules that we have to live by. They say to us, you must change your password every 3 months. And I say, where's the evidence? And they say, it's good practice. And I say, that's not evidence, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that 3 months is better than 6 months? Or that 3 months is good enough rather than 1 month? They don't have the evidence. What do? We don't like changing our passwords every 3 months. So we write our password on a little yellow sticky note and we put it on our computer screen. Or if we're frightened of our IT manager, we write it on a little yellow sticky note and we put it in the top drawer of our desk. So we are always trying to get round the rules. And you'll find that in unintended consequences, people try to get round the rules. So when you develop a new regulation of some kind, you should always think, how would people put this into practice? Would it really work in the real world? When I was an advisor to our health minister in the UK, there used to be a bit of a joke about our civil servants, and I would come forward with a plan of something I thought would improve healthcare, and they'd say to me, yes, Harry, we can see that would work in practice, but would it work in theory? So I think we have to be sure that what we do works in practice. And finally, in right touch regulation, regulators should always be ready to review their own work and to respond to change. Regulators like to tell professionals to have reflective practice. They like to tell professionals to do continuing professional development, to keep up to date. But of all the organizations I know, regulators around the world are sometimes the least likely themselves to have reflective practice, the least likely themselves to keep up to date. So always review and respond to change. So the first law of right touch regulation, and you'll be pleased to know there is only one law, because I like to keep it simple. The one law of right touch regulation is use only the regulatory force necessary to achieve the desired effect. Too much force is a weight of effort, too little won't have the effect that you want. So what are the problems that we're trying to solve in our health systems at the moment, and how can regulation contribute to the problem? Our first mission, of course, is to prevent harm. First, do no harm is the Hippocratic Oath. Second, of course, we want to do good. But the main task of regulation is to prevent harm. And we all know that our health systems are inadequate to meet contemporary needs. The second is every country in the world faces aging populations. And if you think the aging population is somebody else, I'm sorry to have to remind you that it's actually you. Everyone in this room is the aging population. I've actually got there myself at last. I'm officially defined by the British government as an old person, an elder. I don't feel like it. I'm still enjoying traveling the world and working and meeting people, but I am the aging population. I'm also a bit afraid of being called a demographic time bomb, because that's another piece of nonsense that we hear, The population has been aging in all countries, or nearly all countries, for many, many years. For over 50 years, life expectancy has been growing. Only in a very few countries now is life expectancy going down again. So it's not a time bomb, it's not a surprise, it's not something we haven't known about, it's something we should have been planning for the last 30 years or more. Thirdly, we have long-term conditions, increasing in number, diabetes becoming a major problem across the world, arthritis, and then mental conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia and Parkinson's disease. All these things are becoming much more prevalent in the older population. I was talking to a director of nursing in one of the universities in the UK, and he said that all the young people who came in to nursing would say, and he'd say to them, "What do you want to do in nursing?" And they'd say, "I'd like to do pediatric nursing." And he'd say to them, "Well, welcome to geriatric nursing, because that's what you're going to be doing." And I think we need to recognize too that people have multiple long-term conditions. One of the issues about specialties and about the model of regulation that sees health professional expertise as individual rather than teamwork is that people have multiple long-term conditions. People with dementia have arthritis. People with dementia have hearing loss. People with arthritis have mental health problems. So you can't segment the conditions that people have into classified conditions. You have to talk about the person. And I know from my experience here that that is a value in Islam which I've already recognized and learned from working with the Saudi Commission. We also face risk of pandemics. We've been through the COVID pandemic. It's had a huge impact on society, on healthcare, on economic, on the health professionals. But there will be more pandemics. Everyone says there will be more pandemics. So please, let's plan for the next pandemic, and let's recognize it's a future problem. We have increasing cost of health technologies, and I would include in that medicines, of course. And again, you know, in the exhibition outside, there are some glorious and wonderful, shiny new bits of health technology, which will cost you a fortune. Our health minister just this week in the UK has announced that we're going to have a digital health service. He is, to my knowledge, the third health minister over 25 years who has announced we're going to have a digital health service. But it's much harder to do than it actually is to plan or to think about. So we need to absorb technologies, we need to make technologies our servant and not our master. We have a global shortage of health workers. Again, one of the things I know that's happening here and across the nations around the Gulf is, of course, to have more flexibility, more mobility for health professionals, the opportunity for more people to work in different countries. And that's an important thing to achieve. And finally, perhaps matching the first of these bullet points, we have growing health inequalities. In wealthy nations, we have growing health inequalities, which is a problem that we probably didn't envisage. But what is happening is that the well-off are able to buy a higher level and a higher quality of health care than the poorer. And this is particularly extreme in the United States, where there are some people who have no provision of health care at all except through charitable services, and others who, of course, have the best possible health care in the world. I want just to remind you that the World Health Organization has just published an important paper. I think if I go back, if you look on the left-hand side of this slide, that shows the cover of the World Health Organization publication, Health Practitioner Regulation, Design, Reform and Implementation. And this paper was just published formally last month. It's a really important guide. It's primarily aimed at small and middle income countries, but it's the best analysis of international approaches to regulation that I've ever seen. And in this, they set out key policy considerations, which I would strongly encourage anyone who's thinking about regulatory policy to take account of. Making sure that you have the core functions of a regulatory framework. And we're going to hear later this afternoon here about the work that the Saudi Commission is doing on examinations, on setting standards, on improving education. These are the building blocks of a good regulatory system. They talk about the importance of support for regulation from the health system itself, particularly the provision of data. Data is so important, as we know, in health care, and data should be used more than it is at the moment in formulating regulatory policy. They talk about the design principles. First and foremost, that regulation should serve the public interest. Second, that it should be proportionate, balanced. Thirdly, that it should be flexible in emergencies. We've seen how heroic health workers rose to the challenges of COVID, and we are seeing now how heroic health workers in Jordan, in Gaza, in Ukraine are also rising to the challenge, and that's a situation which no regulator can make rules for. That's a situation in which we can only rely on the humanity and the professionalism of the workers, and not think that regulators can require them to follow rules apart from their skill and their heart and their belief. And finally, they remind us that we should think about governance. How do we manage our regulatory systems? And they recommend an umbrella law and an institutional structure, again, something which Saudi Arabia is creating. So I think that the work of the World Health Organization in this area, very recent and very much to be welcomed. And they identify what they call the regulatory practice gap. And I would like to suggest that right touch regulation can help close that gap. And what they mean by that gap is the difference between what the regulators say health professionals should be doing and what health professionals are actually doing. And that goes back to my point about regulation being disconnected very often from the realities of practice. So if you want to assess your regulatory gap, you have to understand the social and environmental context in which people work, and there's a great deal there which I think is very interesting, and I should declare an interest. I was the independent assessor on this piece of work by WHO, but one of the things I pushed them to think more about was the cultural differences that should affect regulation. How do you regulate, say, Ayurvedic medicine India or in those countries? How do you regulate traditional Chinese medicine? How do you take account of Islamic values as opposed to other values in other countries with other religions and belief systems? So I don't want regulation to become another form of colonialism. I don't want imposing Western styles of regulation on other countries. I want people to build from the bottom, as I said before, to see what you're trying to achieve and find the vision to achieve it in your own situation. And develop and test improved regulatory interventions. Again, something the Saudi Commission is doing. So I commend this document to you. I spoke to WHO representatives last week and got permission to share this with you, but it's available on WHO's website, and I hope you will look at it. So finally, really, I just want to tell you what right touch regulation potentially can achieve against those challenges. It can help improve the safety and quality of healthcare, something we all want. It can improve the supply of health workers by reducing barriers, not by increasing them. It can increase the mobility of health workers by having shared values, shared standards, and shared training. It can improve the diversity of health workers by opening up the professions to a wider range of people. It can reduce the cost of healthcare because over-regulation is burdensome. Right touch regulation is not. So we want to reduce the cost of healthcare, and it can encourage innovation in the workforce. So I conclude really just by saying I believe right touch regulation is one of the tools, only one, but one tool we have to improve our health systems and to improve our support for the professionalism of health workers. I believe that the vision, the research they're doing, the dedication they're doing for in the Saudi Commission will bring about the kinds of improvements that we all want to see, inshallah. So thank you very, very much. I can have 1 minute for questions. So that seems like one question. Oh, there's no... Your time's up. Oh, I'll take one. I'll take one question from you. Have we got a microphone? A microphone is on its way. Front row here.
Hello. So I just have one question from a different perspective. How do you see that we can implement the right regulation or the right touch regulation within the CPD frameworks and within the self-directed learning, and how we ensure that this is embedded within that?
So I think my first point would be to make the point about outcomes. So CPD tends to be an input. We expect professionals to do a certain number of hours a year. What we need to do is measure the outcome. So we need to find a way of ensuring that CPD makes a difference. Some CPD does make a difference, but we don't always know that it does. So we need to improve our ability to measure. And when we measure, we can then reduce the amount of CPD people do, take away the things that don't work, and spend more time on the things that do work. But otherwise, people, I mean, in the UK, it's got ridiculous. Doctors are spending hours a year filling forms in to tell the regulator what they've done. Well, I don't think that's very helpful. And I go to a lot of conferences. If I go to a nursing conference, I get a certificate saying I've got CPD points. Well, I'm not a nurse. I've got CPD points for dentistry. I've got CPD points for going to loads of conferences all around the world. I've no idea what that's about. So I think we need to refine CPD. I think it's very important, but we need to focus on the outcome and on training that we know makes a difference.
I think it's all about finding the balance, as you mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, very much.